Hello and welcome to Ask Lovecraft After Dark. I'm Lehman Kessler, and I am incredibly excited to announce tonight's guest, Bill Slavicsek. Bill Slavicsek is a game designer and writer who has worked on numerous products over the years. I have been amazingly acquainted with his work because of the fact that the Star Wars role-playing game put out by West End Games was the first role-playing game that I really cut my teeth on. It was the very first game I ever GM'd. It was the first game that I really played with any regularity, and sadly, weren't able to do the webcam tonight. Otherwise, I would be showing off not only my Star Wars source book and Imperial source book, which I still hold in my hands and still have carried with me from country to country over the years. But I think I even found an old character sheet for the what was it? What was the class? Oh, it was so fantastic! It was one of my favorite. The Interstellar Transient, the space hobo, which I believe was from one of the expansions. But Bill, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for coming on to talk a bit about your work in the heady world, not only of sort of archiving and delving into Star Wars lore during a time when there was not a whole lot of lore to delve into, but also in making a ton of games over the years.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Now, I'm very interested to know, I think I've read in previous interviews that you were a gamer before you got involved in West End Games. Can you talk about how you sort of got into tabletop role-playing?
Yeah, sure. Well, I became a gamer before tabletop role-playing existed. Showing my age, unfortunately. Back in those days, a group of my friends, we played whatever board games were available back then, which was Monopoly and Risk. And then we found the first copy of Cosmic Encounter, some of the SPI games, which were a little too complicated for us at that point, but we made up our own rules and figured it out and played them anyway. And then sometime in the mid-'70s, I'd actually developed a little war game of my own for my gaming group. We used the little Airfax miniatures from England. They were the little plastic soldiers, and we put them on 1-inch squares, and we had battles across the basement floor. But while we were at Polk's Hobby in New York looking for planes and tanks and things to add to the battle, I found the first of the D&D books, and that set me on my path.
And so, I mean, was it love at first sight, or did you kind of have to figure out, all right, what precisely is this? How are we going to, sort of move our way through this? Did it fit well with your group already?
Well, I was already the person that read all the rule books or figured out the rules for the game. So that made me the de facto person to become the dungeon master. And I think I was intrigued and fascinated by the books when I got them. I'm not sure if I started with the hardcovers or if I'd gotten one of the starter boxes first. I can't remember which came first, but we kind of had them both, and we played basic D&D and AD&D and did them the same way, even though they were supposed to be different. But yeah, we figured it out, and I was the game master, and I loved doing stories, so it was a natural fit. And it kind of developed my storytelling ability as time went on.
And were you just ready and willing to looking for game companies that were hiring sort of right out of college, or how did you eventually find yourself in West End Games orbit?
Okay, that's a little different. So I went to college for communication arts, originally planning to go into journalism. I knew I wanted to write. I did a year after college on a local weekly in New York, the Queens Chronicle. And after the first year, I've noticed that we started to repeat the news cycles because that's how weeklies go. And I was starting to get bored. So I started looking for something to work on. I did not know that game companies needed writers or editors at that time. I should have realized that, but it never actually occurred to me. So I was applying to everything from the video game, what was it called?
Was this Vending Machine Times?
Vending Machine Times. Yes, that's it. Thank you. And any of the journals like that looked even remotely like they would not bore me to tears. And the New York Times had an ad for a game editor. It didn't say what company. Didn't really give a lot of details. It was to a PO box, but I applied, and it turned out to be West End Games. They called me in for an interview. They had me do a writing sample where they wanted me to do a review of a game, which I think was to test my developmental process. So I reviewed Wabbit Wampage, which was a fairly new game at that time. A game of like the Warner Brothers cartoon mayhem board game.
Oh, okay.
Without the
So
license.
so was it like Toon? Because Toon was also West End Games, wasn't it?
No, Toon was by Steve Jackson Games, but it was designed by Greg Kostikian, who worked at West End.
Oh, okay.
So there's that connection. But in any event, I went on the interview, and they must have liked me because they hired me. And I went from an editor to a designer rather quickly. Did both jobs, which I continue to do even to today. And about a year in, that's when we got the Star Wars license, and everything changed.
Now, prior to that, you had worked on both Paranoia and Ghostbusters. Is that correct?
Yes, and a number of the board games. When I joined West End, they were primarily a board game company that dabbled in role playing, and they were just beginning to make that switch over to a full-on role playing company. When I got there, they were just getting ready to release Ghostbusters, which was the game system that preceded the Star Wars game, and they had previously released Paranoia. So they were beginning to dip their feet into the role-playing world, and so I got there just at the right time. But before that, I worked on Kings and Things, which was a Tom Wham board game, the West End version of Cosmic Encounter, a game called RAF, which was a solitaire airship battle game from World War II, a couple of games that never came to see the light of fruition, and then they started to put me on the role-playing games. My first one was Ghostbusters Adventure called Scared Stiffs that I co-wrote with John M. Ford. Basically, he gave us what was the equivalent of a novella, and I turned it into an adventure because that's the way he wrote. And from there, I did a couple of Paranoia pieces, and then Star Wars.
How many bad clone names did you have to come up with in Paranoia?
There are no bad clone names. There are only good ones. The computer says
That's right.
so.
The computer would not allow any bad puns or any outre references in the clone names.
The computer only allows good puns. Yeah, I worked on the Hill Sector Blues. I edited that, and I did one of the short adventures in it called Our Pet Bot is Missing, something like that. It was about it was the Jurassic Park story before Jurassic Park was written.
I have Hill Sector Blues floating around here as well. So yeah, okay. So maybe I can find what precisely happens in that.
Yeah, I edited the what was that called? Orcbusters, which was the D&D ripoff or homage, I guess would be a better way to put it, where you went to D&D sector, and Ken Ralston wrote that. And then I also did a lot of the proofreading for the second edition of Paranoia, which I considered to be the best version of the game that's been put out.
Yeah, that's the one that I had. My brothers had tons of, and I flipped through constantly, just trying to like wrap my brain around precisely what I was looking at. But I mean, the cover art on that, right? It was so evocative. The smoking boots, the whispered secret. It's
Yeah, the fun of Paranoia is to treat it as a game you play every once in a while, not a campaign. It doesn't really work as a campaign, but it works great as a one shot.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a frequent. It would frequently get pulled out at my birthday parties. I would force all my friends to come over and make characters, and I think we spent most of the game just in R&D, getting items and killing each other with those said items before we ever even stepped foot on the mission. But that seems in keeping in the spirit.
If you didn't lose 2 or 3 clones just to getting the mission, you weren't doing it right.
And Ghostbusters, did sort of getting to play with sort of an already established product and IP give you kind of a taste of what it was going to be like to work on Star Wars, or were they completely different beasts?
No. Actually, I credit our work on Ghostbusters for helping us get Star Wars. So, it showed that we could do a licensed property, that we cared about licensed properties, and that we did the world. We did well by the worlds that we worked on. We also did some Star Trek board games. West End was not a stranger to licensing. And then we also used the D6 system from Ghostbusters as the basis of what became the Star Wars role-playing game.
Well, let's jump right into Star Wars. Was that something that you were sort of nudging and elbowing to get onto, or were you handed that brief? How did you wind up in that particular setting?
Well, first you got to realize that in the summer of 1977, three things really set my future course. One was the Star Wars movie. I saw it on its opening day, and then I went and saw it 38 times more that summer. I tried to take different people each time so that I got to see their reactions and kind of live the first moment of seeing it again and again and again. That was a very formative film for me. At the same time, that was the summer we really got into D&D. And then also the Terry Brooks' Sword of Shannara was very influential to me that summer. So those three things kind of came together, along with my love of Stephen King and comic books, basically Marvel Comics at the time, all came together and inadvertently trained me for what I was going to work on 10 years later.
Wow.
When West End got Star Wars, I was not initially part of the team. Because we had Star Wars and we had everything else, somebody had to work on everything else, and I was one of the newer people on the staff. But that said, they quickly found that they had too much work and not enough time in the day. So I got pulled in. I helped Paul Murphy develop and edit the Star Wars rules that Greg Astikian wrote. And then when Curtis Smith became our management lead, as Greg and Eric Goldberg were leaving the company, he suddenly didn't have time to finish the book he was working on, which was the Star Wars source book. Up to that point, he had written about 10 pages. He handed them to me and said, "Finish this." And and I did.
And the world is grateful to not have to refer to hammerheads and snaggleteeth ever again.
Yes, that's yeah. The amount of things that I have named and are now official is just, to me, still very humbling, because that's not what we were expecting to happen when we did it.
Was there much pushback from the Lucasfilm themselves about what you all were sort of creating, on the fly? I know that there was, the material you had to draw from were the movies themselves. I imagine there were some, canonical issues of Bantha tracks, and then the Marvel comics, right?
So back in those days, everybody needs to remember there was no internet yet. All your research was done by either watching those movies on your brand new VCR until the tapes broke. We had the Art of books that had the scripts in them. We had the Bantha tracks and Starlog, which had various articles on the build up to the movies and the movies afterwards. And we were allowed to use the Han Solo novels by Brian Daley and the Lando Calrissian novels. I don't remember the author for those. And there was this little tiny book called A Guide to the Star Wars Universe, which later I would do a much larger version of for Lucasfilm. But that's really what we had, other than we got to look in the archives. We had lots of access to blueprints and photo stills from the movies and concept art. And we could ask George questions if they were on an index card and could be answered with a yes or a no. That was the parameters that we were working with. We were the only licensed property really going at that point. The Marvel comics were just winding down. And while we could use them, we had decided not to. The Marvel comics, I have fond memories of them, but there's a lot of goofy stuff. And
are you perhaps referring to the stellar issues where they would go to planets where suddenly they were being princesses and having to joust on lizards and wear giant wimples?
and giant bunnies. Wonderful stuff, but we didn't feel it actually fit the Star Wars universe as we imagined it. And we were trying.
Yeah.
We were trying to be. We loved that stuff. You have to understand that those movies were wonderful to us, and we wanted to do them right, and we wanted to make them something that people were going to want to play. And we wrote those books not just for the role player, but for the fans. And as many people as played the game, 3 or 4 times that many bought the books just to read them.
Now, how much discussions did you guys have to have about the holiday special and what to include? Like, was there like agonizing nights over the role of Lumpy in the Star Wars canon?
No. I'll let you in on a little secret.
Uh-oh.
Anything that I decided to leave out because I didn't think it was good for the property kind of just got pushed to the wayside. So I became kind of an unofficial gatekeeper of what was going to be canon, at least for the West End stuff. And then later, well, we'll talk about that later for other things as time went on. But we did take some stuff from the special. We took the idea of Life Day and some of the stuff about the Wookiees, not the lumpy part, but some of their traditions were built in because some of that was also in the Brian Daly books. The whole idea of the life debt and Chewbacca pledging himself to Han for saving him from something that they left out of the Solo movie.
And had Caravan of Courage and Battle for Endor come out by the time you guys started work on this?
Yes, we also didn't really delve into those because, again, they did not feel like they fit exactly what we were thinking.
So this isn't where the Night Sisters of Dathomir kind of got worked in, because I think eventually that was sort of the weird, long-lasting legacy of Battle for Endor.
That's a way to take something that wasn't cool initially and make it cool. I think they did a good job with the Night Sisters later, but I think that happened in one of the novels. That was after we were doing stuff.
Okay. All right.
Because the novels didn't start up again until Tim Zahn in his trilogy that kicked off in 1991. So by that point, we had already really pushed out most of the defining books that West End created.
And at this point, were folks already looking to the role-playing game as a kind of de facto resource? Because again, as you pointed out, there's not a lot of, if you're trying to figure out, all right, what is this alien race called? I don't really have a book to go to. Oh, well, there's this thing that says it's Star Wars source book. I don't play the game, but okay, this alien's called a blah. That's what I'm going to put in my story or my zine or whatever.
Yeah. So going back to the origins, we won the contract from Lucasfilm. I understand a number of the other companies had been bidding on it. FASA at the time, TSR, rumors of others. Somehow we wound up with it, which, I still find amazing because we were not the biggest kid on the block, but we got it. And like I said, I think part of it was what we did on Ghostbusters. Part of it was the plan we had for the line. And then I guess part of it was the money that Scott Poulter, the owner of West End at the time, was willing to throw at it. But we had to teach Lucasfilm what a role-playing game was. They expected us just to use what was ever in the movies, and that was it. And I told them, no, we need more than that. You guys can build a set and show 2 walls and a door. I need to build the whole room and then the land outside the room and the world that it's sitting on. And so there was a little bit of tension in the beginning as we worked through that. But very quickly, they saw what we were doing and they liked it. I had to convince them that we were allowed to change the names, that Hammerhead we'll use it, but it's an insult. It's not what they call themselves. And so that's how they became the Ithorians. Greedo's people are not called Greedo. Greedo was one of them. They were the Rhodians. We developed that. Yeah, Bib Fortuna was not the name of all of those people. So we had to work through that with them. What's a name that's good for the prop guy to grab the mask and know which one he's got to put on the actor is one thing, but a name that's really going to resonate as real and part of the world is a totally different thing. And they eventually let me do that. The Star Wars source book is full of that kind of stuff. Planets. We made up companies. We made up the name of the various ships. I was just at Galaxy's Edge in Disney World, and they have the big sign that the Millennium Falcon is a YT 1300. I'm like, oh well, we came up with that years ago, and so that's just neat to see that it's still being used today. Did
you have to come up with any kind of style guide for naming? Like, all right, guys, we need to make sure that we don't have too many Q's over here or too many X's. Like, were you drawing upon anything, or was it really just we need a name for this hammerhead guy? Ithorian? Sure, that works.
I have a good ear for names, or at least I think so. And as this all developed, I became the person overseeing the Star Wars line at West End. So everything that we published went through me. So while I didn't have a style guide, I had one in my head. We did develop some writers' guidelines, and I think they've been posted. People have found them and posted them over the years. I no longer have a copy. It was only like 1 or 2 pages long. I think it was 2 sides of a single sheet so that we could give it to freelancers. But that was very general, and told you we are space opera, not hard science fiction, and things along those lines. For me, a name needs to sound real, be pronounceable, and not sound goofy. So when the various writers we were working with sent stuff in, I would go through it all, and I would either keep their names or I would adjust them slightly to try to stay in the vein of what they were going for. And in a few cases, I would throw them out completely and start from scratch because they just weren't hitting what I thought was the right mark. So that's how that kind of developed. But once we got a number of these books out and Lucasfilm was becoming more and more not only intrigued with what we were doing and happy with it, they also began to see the potential. Like I said, at the time, we were the only license they had. They had no more novels coming out. They had no more comics coming out. The only other thing besides us in their 10th year anniversary was the launch of Star Tours at Disneyland. So they were really winding down, waiting for whenever George was going to do another movie. But then they saw the potential in the license, or at least that's my interpretation of what occurred. And then they began to shop it around using our material, not only to show them, hey, look, there is still life here, but you don't have to start from scratch. Here's a box of what West End has done. You can use that as something to work from. And they wanted people to work from it because they wanted it all to be in continuity. So we were the beginning of what today is, they call the Story Group, kind of really started with the partnership between West End and the licensing group at LFL.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask about. I mean, I grew up and was starting to see the kind of the fights over, canon. And it almost, if you feel like an early Christian, with like the Nestorians and the Arians all like shouting at each other, about what is true Star Wars? No, only the films are true Star Wars. No, the expanded universe is what, counts. The Zahn novels are what count. And you get all this sort of back and forth, and to the point that, you get some really toxic fights these days about, I remember when they said that the expanded universe was no longer going to be considered canon, or the legacy was not being it was sort of being pushed aside. There was so much anger because so many people had invested in these sort of what I always viewed as kind of side projects or from my perspective, they weren't canonical. They weren't they weren't in the films, so they don't truly count. But you were literally, as you said, gatekeeping and trying to figure out the continuity and how it all fit together. Where is Londo during the Battle of Yavin? Because we got to pin him down. Because if this GM is trying to tell his players, no, you can't meet with Londo because he's off, building the Sun Killer. That there's got to be sort of a point of reference there. So what was it like being in the trenches of actually seeing that develop and seeing that tension form?
Well, because there was no internet yet, we didn't really see that tension. We got some of it at conventions, and you saw some of it in magazine articles, but that was a little later. While we were doing it, we were just trying to make the best products we could make. And we were trying to do it in such a way that we were true to the films and the nature of the films within our own products, and then true to the continuity that we were building. Now, when Lucasfilm decided to take that same continuity and give it to the novel writers and to the comic books that came later from Dark Horse, they began to use the things that we had created. Not stories per se, but names and planets and people and equipment and ships. A lot of the ships are all from our books. And you mentioned when Lucasfilm was bought by Disney, they decided to put aside the expanded universe. And I think that was the right decision at that time. You didn't want to hamper all this new possibilities with what ranges from really good books to really not so good books, depending on where you are in the timeline of the expanded universe. But I don't know if you know or remember, but the press release they sent out said, we'll still use what's good. We'll pick and choose and bring it back as necessary and as possible. And there's still stuff that we're going to use right out of the gate, like all that stuff that the role-playing game made. And they mentioned, Sinair, the TIE Fighter company, and the name of the aliens, and something else. I have a copy of that press release someplace. So that was, it was very gratifying, and we laid the foundation for the expanded universe, and that foundation is still being used, even if the stuff riding on top of the road isn't the same, if that makes any sense to you.
No, absolutely.
So, and I think it all comes down to we weren't just fans. We were fans that were capable of creating good material. And I think the fact that it's still being used kind of shows that. And, I'm kind of proud of that.
Well, one tool that you created that I found incredibly useful was the Star Wars database. You talk about how a lot of this, is happening in the pre-internet era, but as soon as we're into the internet era, the Star Wars database was incredibly useful as far as, it literally had, tabs so you could see who is this character in the movie? What do they do? Who is this sort of, the production of this character, like who played them and, what was sort of the design for it. And then you had the big expanded universe. This, random admiral was from this planet and his parents were farmers and da-da-da-da-da. And it was a really a great way to kind of see how this information could be parsed out very simply, very elegantly. And was all of that just you sort of taking the notes that you had developed from your time at West End and just putting them online? Or was that something you were actively curating for a while?
Well, the way that occurred is, as I understand it, when I left West End, Lucy Wilson, who was in charge of the licensing group at the time at Lucasfilm, she wanted basically what was in my head in a book. Because at the time, like I said, I was kind of becoming like a gatekeeper. They had their editors at LFL, but they would send things from the comics or from the novels to us at West End to also give feedback, and they'd ask us questions because, frankly, we knew the stuff better than they did, in at least at the level of detail that we're talking about. So they contracted me with Del Rey to write the second edition of A Guide to the Star Wars Universe. So the first database you're talking about was a 400-page paperback book with everything I could fit into it in dictionary format, from names of planets to names of people to equipment to characters, you name it. If I could fit it in the book and I thought it belonged in the book, it became the first of those databases that you're talking about, even though it wasn't yet on the computer. When later, when I was at West End Games, and when I was at Wizards of the Coast, and we got the license back at that point, and did the D20 version of the Star Wars RPG, Lucasfilm hired a person named Leland Chee, who's still part of the story team to this day, and he put together what became the Holocron, which started with my book, but used a whole bunch of other material that he was able to gather from the expanded universe that came later, and the new movies that were beginning to be developed that were the prequels. And that became, so I had a tangential hand in that database, but that was really handled by Leland.
Transitioning to, I guess, from working on the West End game to now being at Hasbro, being at Wizards of the Coast and doing the sort of the new D20 version based on this D&D model. What was that like, revisiting the same sort of world, the same setting, but in a very different mechanical space? Like, those are two, I played a ton of both of those games, and they are very, very different, both in how they sort of approach storytelling and how they just approach rolling dice.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. They are different mechanical games. The D20 game has got a lot more. I guess you'd say it's more robust, but also more complex. But my first goal was to trim that down as much as I could, and still make a more accessible cinematic version of the D20 game to use for the Star Wars game. So if you compare, say, D&D 3.5 to the D20 Star Wars game, if D&D is a 10 in complexity, Star Wars is like 6 or 7. So we dialed it down a little bit, both for the wider audience we hope to get through the property of Star Wars, and to just make it a little faster and more cinematic play around the table. The biggest difference to me was when we did the original Star Wars game, we were the only game in town, as it were. So we had nobody else we had to worry about. We were defining everything the first time. By the time we get to the Wizards of the Coast version, you've got the novels are coming out. We have the DK books that do, frankly, a much prettier job at the books we used to do at West End Games, because they've got much more money for the art and for the diagrams. So we couldn't be the cutting edge of the license anymore. We had to really embrace that we were just the role-playing game, as opposed to, as I said, when we were doing the West End version, we were also writing it to be resources for just fans of the property, and that was a little different in the Wizards days. We still did source books and things, but they were really focused on use in the game first, not fan reading material, which is what the West End stuff was really as its primary function as we were thinking about it.
Was there a temptation to go back to the old mechanic? If you've got too many dark side points, the GM snatched your character sheet away from you?
No, because I never figured out how to actually use that at the table.
Oh, the secret comes out.
I was the editor for the rules, for those rules. I mean, I recently ran the old D6 game at a couple of conventions for the 40th and 30th anniversary the 30th anniversary of the game a couple of years ago. And, I love the D6 system, but it's 30 years old. I've learned a lot about game design over the years. So I have updated the rules myself to make them a little more streamlined, a little faster to use, and to make for a better experience for the current player at the table at a convention. So everything can be improved and refined, especially after 30 years.
And do you still find yourself able to get to the game table as a hobbyist, or is sort of years of being in being in the muck and seeing the sausage being made you be like, what's nice? Croquet is nice. No one's yelling at you about the armor class breakdown of croquet.
No, we still play. We play. I'm in a weekly D&D game with people from ZeniMax, and we'll also break away to try something else. We tried the new Tor game that came out. We've played with things like Pulp Cthulhu, and a lot of board games. So no, I'm still a gamer at heart and try to play whenever I can.
Fantastic. So you've now sort of shifted into the online world and digital gaming was with your work on the Elder Scrolls online game. Can you tell us how you got involved in that project, and sort of have you been working in sort of video gaming for a while, or was this fairly new?
So after West End, I did a couple of years as a freelancer where I did a bunch of work for TSR, which led to them hiring me in the early 90s. I was at TSR when the company kind of collapsed and Wizards of the Coast came in and bought us. They moved a bunch of us to the West Coast, me included. When I got out there, they were trying to decide how they were going to deal with the TSR crew, and they were looking for basically a leader for that division of the company. I was originally on the committee to help find that person. After we interviewed like 6 to 10 people, got a call from Peter Ackison one night, the owner of Wizards at the time, and he said, "We're going to interview you tomorrow, Bill, so be ready." I said, "What? Really? Why? I didn't ask for this." And he said, "No, we're gonna interview you." So they interviewed me, and I became director of R&D for Dungeons and Dragons, and I did that for 14 years. And during that period, we did a lot of computer game licenses. So I was tangential to those things. I did a lot of approvals. I did a lot of creative direction of games that were being made for us. But I hadn't actually worked on a game specifically. I guess the closest you might say is when BioWare did the Knights of the Old Republic game, the original single-player computer game. They used the RD20 game mechanics, and I helped review the big design document that was basically a copy of our rule book, but then turned into a computer game. And I went through that for them and gave them loads of feedback. Of course, by the time they released, Wizards and Hasbro had given the rights to our games to Atari, and we didn't want to cause any waves with this new relationship, so they never said that. They couldn't say that the D20 system was behind Knights of the Old Republic. But everybody knew, and everybody thought that they stole it from us. And they're like, no, we did it together. We just couldn't say.
Oh, that's fascinating. Because I played both, and I was like, oh, okay, this is based on D20. All right, I recognize all of these saves that I'm making, and buying all these Force powers. But I never realized that you guys had to keep this relationship secret and in the dark.
Yeah, it was when Hasbro decided to give D&D rights to Atari. There was some legal issue, and they didn't want to. Even though we had been working on that first, they didn't want to cause problems with the new license, and so Lucasfilm and BioWare agreed to, keep it under the table, which was unfortunate because I thought it would have helped our game as well as theirs. But que sera, sera. In any event, after 14 years of all of that, Wizards and I parted ways, and I was looking for my next adventure, as it were, and I ran into Zeb Cook, who is an old TSR colleague who was working on the Elder Scrolls Online game, and I met him at a GDC in Austin that year, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Nothing." And he said, "Come work for me." And I said, "Okay." And that's how I got into computer games. I started as a writer, and now I'm the lead writer for the Elder Scrolls Online. and it's been a blast.
And what is that like to work? Not only in a setting where your words are going to be put into such a big visual digital swimming pool, but also writing for something that's so dynamic, where there's sort of this expectation, okay, there's going to be new events, there's going to be sort of, the story has to progress, although it can't progress too much because you still got people discovering the game and they've got to, work their ways up through the levels. What has that been like for you?
So, on one hand, a lot of what we did on the tabletop is exactly what we do in a computer game because we don't know who the protagonist is, just like we didn't know who the main characters are in a role playing game. We're setting up situations and telling stories without having that protagonist's point of view. The big difference is that our game is fully voiced, so I'm writing dialogue. Most of what I write on a daily basis is putting words in people's mouths and having actors perform the words that we've written, which is a different type of thrill to listen to, like John Cleese read your words and perform them. It's pretty amazing. But you mentioned the great thing about the Elder Scrolls Online is we're not level based, so you can start anywhere and play any of the content whenever. So if you're just starting and your friend's been playing for 3 years, you don't have to catch up in level. You can go play with them immediately. So what that does mean is that we're constantly adding new content to the game. We do 4 releases a year of new content, which is loads of stories, loads of characters. The big trick is to find ways not to repeat yourself, but that's the challenge and the fun.
And is it nice to be able to work with a property that you don't have to be responsible for? You can go and look at someone else's giant database that they've put together?
Yes. Like with Star Wars, we're kind of a licensee because we do the online game, whereas Bethesda, our sister studio, is the holder of the single-player game, which is considered the core version of the game. But frankly, at this point, we've actually written and made more content than they have, just because of our cadence. We're in our 6th year, 4 releases a year, so we've turned out a ton of content for the Elder Scrolls Online. We're set in the past of the game, whereas Skyrim is like 800 years in our future. So we're very respectful of that. We make sure we are just like with Star Wars and Ghostbusters. We treat the property as best we can and do what we think is right for it.
Throughout your career, has there been a sort of a property white whale beyond just Star Wars that you've ever been like, you know what? I think I could make the perfect game for this. This is, the world needs my Blues Brothers role-playing game, or the world needs my Howard the Duck role-playing game. Has there been some big white whale that you're still yearning for after all these years?
Not another property. Certainly, we got the Marvel license at one point at Wizards, but I didn't get to work on that. And that would have been a nice thing to add to my resume, since I'm a big fan of the Marvel stuff.
Is there a particular Marvel line you would have had fun with?
If you get into a role-playing game, it's got to be a team, so either X-Men or Avengers. People have done James Bond, the role-playing game, or Indiana Jones, the role-playing game, but it's tougher. Those properties are built around a single character, so it's tougher. Things like Star Wars, you had a group right from the beginning. Even the cartoon Rebels, the animated series, was all about a group of characters. It was almost like it was taken right out of our role-playing game. We got a ship, we got a crew, off we go to fight the Empire. But the things that I've liked to do when I'm not working on somebody else's world, Greg Gordon and I developed the Torg universe many years ago. which was, I always wanted to create something from scratch, show that I could do that. Rich Baker and I did the Alternity game. I did the T20 Modern game. So my itch has really been not another licensed property, but things that are my own. So if I ever get around to it, the next thing would probably be something horror related. It'd probably be my next, the next thing I would like to, put my mark on.
Very cool. In the midst of all of this writing that you have been doing, you also managed to write a book about your work on Star Wars, Defining a Galaxy. Can you tell me about how that particular project came about and what the response to it has been like?
Yeah, it was the 30th anniversary of, well, actually, it was the 40th anniversary of the Star Wars film. It was beginning of 2017. And my wife and I decided, this is pretty big. Let's go to Star Wars Celebration this year. And we're going to go just as fans. No commitments, no talking, just go and, be part of the celebration. And that's when I also realized that if it was the 40th anniversary of the movie, it was the 30th anniversary of the role-playing game that got me into all of this. So the first thing that happened as we were getting ready to go to Celebration, Pablo Hidalgo, who's over at Lucasfilm Story Group and used to work at West End after me, we started talking. We were talking about doing some kind of panel at Celebration to honor the 30th anniversary of the role-playing game. We couldn't make that come together, but that got me thinking that, this is a pretty big deal, and I want to write down my memories of it just for myself, just because I didn't want to lose them. And I started writing the book, mostly as an exercise for myself. As that year was progressing, Sterling Hershey, another Star Wars freelancer who's worked on every version of the role-playing game, including the recent Fantasy Flight stuff, he contacted me and said, hey, we're going to do a panel at Gen Con that honors the 30 years of the game. Would you be willing to sit in on it? And I said, yeah, sure. So it was Sterling, myself, Pablo, and Sam, the leader of the role-playing game for Fantasy Flight. Sam, I don't remember Sam's last name. In any event, I took what I had been writing and worked it into the PowerPoint that we were all going to use to do this talk, and that developed alongside the book. And what else happened that year? I also got invited to Lucca, which is an Italian game show. It's a big comic and game fair that takes place in a little town called Lucca in Italy, which is a medieval town surrounded by a wall. Are you still there?
I am. I'm right here.
Okay, sorry. Thought I lost you again. And I took that same presentation we did at Gen Con, worked it for them, and at the same time continued to put it into the book. So kind of a talk became the book became the talk. I finished it right around the time that Solo came out the following year. Talked with some friends from my Wizards days, my TSR days, who now run a little game company called Rogue Genius Games, and they said, "Hey, we'll publish that for you." And I said, "Oh, great!" And so they put it up, and it's available both at Amazon and at DriveThruRPG, and it's not going to let me retire, but it's certainly done pretty well, and it's gotten great reviews. And like I said, I did it more from my own memory, so I didn't lose those ideas and I didn't lose the story of what was going on.
That's fantastic. Before I let you go, I do have to ask, because it is probably my absolute favorite part of what might be my favorite role-playing book ever written. Can you tell me about Compnor in the Imperial Source Book? Because that the very idea of that, I have been dreaming about running either a Fiasco or Paranoia style games just about Compnor agents, based on reading that section of that book over and over and over again, because it is a piece of beauty.
So a lot of credit for that goes to Greg Gordon, who was the primary designer for the Imperial Sourcebook. I was his editor and developer, and I wrote some chunks of that. A lot of the early stuff on Palpatine I put together, but the Compnor stuff was mostly Greg taking the whole idea of, we had begun to develop the way the Empire works in some of the adventures. We introduced the Imperial Security Bureau. Their agents became some of our best villains in the early products. And he just took that and took it to a whole other level with his love of politics and political history. And he worked that all in to create, basically this propaganda machine that's part of the whole Compnor mythos. His idea was you can't run an empire without this kind of stuff. So let me explain it. And between that and the Battle of Order, that was all Greg.
Fantastic. Well, because you've talked about how it's been amazing to see properties outside of the movies like Rebels and Clone Wars that do feel like these old school role playing games. I watch those shows and yeah, I'm like, okay, I can see them. I can see the GM setting them up and telling them you got to go to this planet and get this dissident off, or you got to get these food supplies there before the Empire shows up. It's that is in some ways been one of the most fun things to come out of the whole sort of Star Wars machine over the last few years.
And it's not just Star Wars. I mean, so much of the creatives that are working today, both in Hollywood and in other entertainment fields, grew up playing the games that we were creating. I've seen interviews with Kevin Feige from Marvel talking about, when he had the Star Wars Sourcebook as a kid. And the guys who made Stranger Things were big D&D players. I think it's a credit to the work and the games that were created that helped the next generation of storytellers come online. And I think you're just seeing that influence, and they're much more prevalent than they had been in my day when there was fewer of us, and the hobby was still new and developing. But I think that's where you're getting a lot of that. People, storytellers, writers like myself, cut our teeth on being a DM, and then took the love of those things and continue to utilize them in whatever they're working on today. And I think that's really great. And I never thought I would hear the word Twi'lek in an official coming out of an actor's mouth. And that's just, it was amazing when I first saw it put on an action figure, and I thought that was going to be the extent of it. But as it's worked, in one of the movies recently, Finn says "medpack" twice. So those are the key moments in my memory of putting all this stuff together.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. If folks are interested in your work that you're doing and finding out more about what's going on, where can they go?
I have a website, billslavicsek.com, which is basically just a collection of all of my work over the years. I'm on Twitter at Slavicsek. I think that's how you do that, at Slavicsek, where I just post about, things that might interest people that I'm working on. And then Defining a Galaxy is available both at Amazon.com and DriveThruRPG as an e-download, as a downloadable book, or through DriveThru if you want an actual physical copy. You can get a print on demand. But otherwise, go play Elder Scrolls Online, because that's got a lot of my work in it too.
Fantastic. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure. You have been listening to Ask Lovecraft After Dark, the occasional sister program of Ask Lovecraft. If you'd like to know more about that, you can go to asklovecraft.com. You can follow me over at Twitter at Lehman Kessler. If you'd like to support this program, you can do so at patreon.com/asklovecraft. And if you want to talk about this show or any others, you can go to Facebook and join the Ask Lovecraft Appreciation Society. We have all sorts of fun conversations about the world of Lovecraft and beyond. It's been an absolute pleasure having Bill on. Bill, thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing what comes next.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, everyone. Have a great night.